You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. Let me ask you a question. Is being a dad freaking you out? Do you feel like you're trapped in a triangle of excessive anger, guilt, and anxiety? In other words, are you feeling like you're stuck in this emotional Bermuda Triangle? Now, for those of you who don't know, when I was a kid, I was heavily into UFOs, the supernatural, and the Bermuda Triangle ranked very highly on my list of, curiosities that I really wanted to understand and get to the bottom of. Never really did. But for those of you who don't know what the Bermuda Triangle is, it's an area in the Atlantic Ocean where ships and planes have disappeared under very mysterious circumstances. And as far as I'm concerned, excessive anger, guilt, and anxiety creates an emotional triangle that can engulf our relationships with our sons. So I'm talking about it from a dad's perspective. Now, intuitively, I suspect that most of you do know that this can create a profound impact on your relationship with your son. I can't imagine anybody going, "Oh no, it's so cool. It's fine. I can, let my anger fly and, I can feel, my own guilt, but I won't express it to anybody." Same with anxiety. No one really knows that I'm anxious except the way that I behave. And then that's attributed to anger and rage. But yeah, no, it doesn't have any impact on anybody. I can tell you that is fundamentally bullshit. So let's talk a little bit about what I want to do with this particular episode. So firstly, I want to talk about those three emotions: excessive anger, which also includes rage, guilt, and anxiety. Because unless you're superhuman, most of you have experienced that particular, event. Something happens between you and your kid, you lose your shit, and then later on you feel guilty, and the next time around when something else happens, you feel both anxious and angry, and it really makes a mess of the whole relationship. So let's talk a little bit about excessive anger. So excessive anger generally occurs when we haven't dealt with underlying feelings, often feelings of hurt or sadness, guilt, anxiety, shame. And it's a defense mechanism in a way. It's sort of there possibly to try and protect our ego, for want of a better word, or our self. And when we are not in a sense aware of that emotion and the dynamic underneath that emotion, it can explode. So suddenly we go from 0 to 100 and the walls are shaking, the windows are blowing out, and the kid's fundamentally in a state of anxiety. Now, if it's a teenager, you might get two reactions. One is he might go for you physically. Alternatively, and this is more common than not, is they'll storm out. It's in a sense, it'll be "fuck you, I'm out of here." Now, for a smaller child, what you're going to get is essentially that child immediately feeling an intense, an intense fear. It's not anxiety, because to the child, that threat is real. You are big, you are scary. And so your son, or daughter for that matter, is going to begin to avoid you in order to avoid any further confrontation. Now, interestingly, my experience working with a lot of dads is that we're more likely to be emotionally regulated with girls than we are with boys. And I've watched this from the sideline on sporting fields, I've watched it in surf, I've watched it in social situations. Okay, let me talk about guilt. Now, one of the things that's interesting about guilt is that it makes dads overly critical of their son. And so what happens is I'm constantly pointing out my son's flaws and mistakes. And so what's going to eventuate is that that boy is going to create or experience a sense of inadequacy. And also it's going to lead to feelings of resentment towards dad. So this simmering, this low undercurrent of anger and potential rage. Now, what about anxiety? Now, I talked about fear, but anxiety is the state of this internal sense of not feeling safe and secure. I'm constantly under threat. And it's an important aspect in the role of the emotional triangle. Because one of the ways that, as a dad, I might try and compensate for the anger and, the picking on my kid is to actually become overprotective or, in some instances, controlling of my son so he doesn't make mistakes. And, also there's that part where I fear of losing the relationship. Now, ironically, those three are the very elements, emotional elements in your relationship with your son that's going to drive him away. So the boy in that instance doesn't learn a lot of autonomy or agency. And again, dealing with, having an anxious dad means that the relationship with your son's going to be strained, where he either feels smothered or trapped or abandoned because there's no acknowledgement and validation of him as a growing person. So overall, the emotional triangle created by the excessive anger and guilt and anxiety has a massive impact on the father-son relationship. And I think we owe it to our kids that we address this and we don't perpetuate it. Too many times I've heard, sons who've had, that type of dad say, it wasn't until he was on his deathbed that he could actually say, listen, son, I'm sorry for the way that I was, but I didn't know any different. Well, guess what, folks? We know how to be different. And it's, in a sense, all our responsibilities as a father to get our shit together and so that this doesn't perpetuate. Now, you might go, oh, it's very negative today. There's a few swear words in it. And the reason for it is because I'm very passionate about this. So how can we avoid getting trapped in the Bermuda Triangle? Well, let me give you a little bit of a framework, as I always do. Now, we know that dads, just like mums, are critical to a child's emotional and social development. So the next part of this podcast is about exploring the core skills that we as dads need to raise well-adjusted and independent kids that have an internal, safe and secure relationship with themselves so that they don't feel those negative emotions as intensely as they do when they don't. So remember what I've been talking a lot about, which is the whole issue of attachment, right? That emotional bond that develops between a child and their primary caregiver, mum, dad. And in that relationship, as the parent, I have a responsibility to provide a safe and nurturing environment where the child my son, my daughter learns to trust and depend on me. And this is just totally, this is the, quantum theory for raising kids, is that is fundamentally essential for a child's healthy emotional and social development. A secure attachment is the target. So, what's the first skill that I think we need to nail in this framework? And so, it is fundamentally developing a secure attachment with your child. And so that starts from the very beginning. In fact, I'd argue that it starts in utero. If you're not the person carrying the baby, but you're in the orbit, you need to make sure that your partner feels safe and secure in their relationship with you as much as possible. And that, in a sense, reduces the stress of the mother, and the child has a better opportunity to mature in utero. And so when the child's born, we've already got a connection. Now, in doing this, we as dads are promoting, helping the child to build trust and to be able to depend on me. Right? Now, that is, in the early stages, fundamentally important. Now, the second skill that I encourage is independence. And this is interesting because it flies in the face of, our tendency to want to protect children all the time. And I'm not saying, don't protect. What I'm saying is that, in a nutshell, don't do for your child what it's capable of doing for themselves. We as dads can help our kids develop independence by providing them with opportunities to make decisions and solve problems independently. We also need to encourage kids to explore their interests, to try new things and take risks. But we also need to encourage them that when they do these things, they are also responsible for the consequences. Now, when we do this, we begin to shape a relationship between us, again, that's more and more trusting, and where the child actually is more likely to be able to take some better calculated risks rather than being impulsive and running on immediate needs gratification and showing low frustration tolerance. Now, the third skill is really about helping the kid to learn problem-solving skills. Okay? Helping your child to develop problem-solving skills is critical to their independence. Right? Now, you are also now sort of probably starting to go, where's he going with this? On the one hand, we're talking about 3 negative emotions, the Bermuda Triangle. Now we're talking about independence. Well, if you are a dad that's flying off the handles, that operates from a place of feeling guilty once you've done that, and then you feel anxious in your interaction the next time, your son especially is going to wonder, where the hell are you coming from? What's going on for you? Because they sense that you're emotionally a mess. Right? Now, don't get me wrong. We all do things in our relationships with our kids where, from time to time, we take a step back and go, oh, stuffed up on this one. And that's okay. But when this is a significant pattern in the relationship between you and your child or children, you've got a problem on your hand. And the way that you've got a problem on your hands is by the way the child behaves. We know from lots of studies that most of the characteristics in children are not necessarily just innate, they're actually socially learned. So if you've got a kid who's bullying someone, I'd be looking at my relationship with my child that makes him feel that he needs to bully somebody else. So, the fourth skill in this model is then setting boundary and limits, right? Now, I can't do that if I'm a bundle of anger I'm trying to suppress most of the time, and that I feel guilt and shame and feel anxious about my relationship, my interaction with my kid. So I'm confused about how to set these boundaries and limits. Children need boundaries and they need limits to feel safe and secure. Right? So, the big issue, people talking about, I don't know what to do. My kid's always on social media. Your kid wouldn't be on social media if they didn't have a mobile phone, a smartphone, right? Now, if you really insist on giving that child a phone, get a dumb phone, a Nokia or something like that. Right? Don't give him the latest Apple whiz bang number that, is $1,000 and could fly the Apollo mission to the moon. Because he's not going to use that for any interest in science or, knowledge. He's going to use that for nefarious purposes. Because kids do that. I'm sure that most of us of my generation, if we had this, would probably have done something similar. So the fifth core skill that I want to put down is that we need to foster self-esteem. And I'm always a bit reluctant with the whole notion of self-esteem because I sort of see it simply as I feel good about myself and I'm willing to take responsibility when I stuff up. Okay, so no, I'm not a failure, which brings me to another point. At some point, I'm going to make a podcast on that whole idea. But I do have to accept that at some things I have maybe failed. Now, that's not I'm a failure. That's conceptually quite different to I have failed at math. So, we need to really pull together some core skills that really shape, firstly, our relationship with our son, daughter, but also really how to keep this dynamic because it's not a simple equation. My well-being as a dad is going to be on my sleeve in a way. If I can't regulate my feelings, whether they are anger, whether they are guilt, whether they are anxiety, whether they are shame, I'm eventually going to be stuck in a no man's land, the Bermuda Triangle. And in that triangle, not only is my emotional relationship with my son disturbed, but also the practical things that my son needs to learn impaired. Why, why doesn't he get out of bed earlier? Well, I have to think about what's going on. Self-awareness, again, becomes one of the core elements in this. So I know that you might feel that this podcast has been a bit bitty, and it has. It's been two bits. One is the Emotional Bermuda Triangle, and secondly, how do I raise an independent kid? And that is not a child that is unattached. It is a child that is secure in their own attachment and therefore secure in their attachment with others, especially those that are truly important. Because sometimes, kids walk with their feet. Gabor Mate talks about that in his book about hold on to your children, families more important than peers. They and everyone goes, they need their friends and so on. They need their family first, frankly. And I think that's part of the focus that we need to bring to play, is that where are the priorities? Who are the priorities? So on that note, I want to say thank you for listening. Let me invite you to the next podcast. Right now, I'm not sure what that it's going to be, but, it'll be interesting. At least I think so. So until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noartainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.